Hi, my name is Stephanie Creary, and I'm Assistant Professor of Management at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. And I'm delighted to be here today with Gwen Houston, who is Consultant Advisor committed to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. For over 20 years, she was a business leader and a former Chief Diversity Officer for several global corporations. Gwen, we're so excited to have you here and to learn from you. Our topic today is around the broad idea of creating equity and opportunity, no small feat, in corporations today. But we're interested in getting your insights on this topic, what you have had to deal with and address in the past, our current times that we're dealing with now as issues of racial injustice and racism have become exacerbated and magnified on the global stage, and certainly our future. Is it hopeful, and what do we have to think about that? So that's sort of going to be the flow of our conversation today, and I'm just happy to have you here. You wrote this brilliant piece. It's called Corporate America's Black Equity Gap. CEOs must take the lead, and you posted it to Medium on June 29th. And it hit me, I think, in a really deep place, probably because, I am a Black woman, and certainly a piece about Black equity and Black experiences in the workplace is going to feel personal. But like you, for some time, I've been examining these issues of corporate diversity and inclusion. And I just wanted to start by reading an excerpt just to set the stage for some of the more specific questions I have for you. So
Okay.
in reflecting on the past, here's what you said. For decades now, corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have been in place across various U.S. industries, but the level of sustainable commitment from leadership has ebbed and flowed dramatically. As a retired corporate business leader and former chief diversity officer for several global corporations, this has been my life's work. Although diversity practitioners have effectively proven the business value of DEI initiatives, very few companies and organizations have made meaningful strides to improve the workplace. And then you go on to say that some industries are at the beginning of this work and but many are making little to no meaningful change. So let's start there with that sort of I often like to refer to things as, pre-summer of 2020. That was certainly the situation. Can we talk a little bit about the racial equity problem for Black professionals in the corporate sector? Historically, what is this problem and how bad has it been?
Wow. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Stephanie. It's wonderful to engage in this type of conversation because it's so timely, it's so urgent, it's so relevant, and boy, is it real. So when it comes to talking about, the whole issue of racial equity and Black professionals in the workplace, what strikes me in terms of how severe and how bad it is that even after a generation of very well-educated and extraordinarily talented Black professionals have forged a path through corporate America, and with another generation following, we still don't see significant and sustainable progress. Case in point, in 2014, Black CEOs made up about 1.5, close to 2% of the Fortune 500. Today, that number is only 4 Black CEOs, making up less than 1% of the Fortune 500 population. So we're not moving in the right direction. We're losing ground, and it's this constant feeling of, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Right. When it comes to our success in the workplace. And I think that's what's really glaring for me. Also, when you look at the nation's largest healthcare companies, so you have, CVS, they have no Black executives on their senior leadership team. What's interesting is they acquired Aetna, a company I used to work for, which had a Black CEO and one of the most racially and gender diverse executive leadership teams I've ever worked for. And so, you see that in finance. You've got Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo. None of them have Black professionals on the executive team. And then let's move to tech, which was my last foray. I retired as Microsoft's Chief Diversity Officer. 0 members of the executive leadership team at Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google. So this is a real glaring issue.
And I hesitate to ask this next question, especially since you just explained a downward trend in progress, if even you can sort of make a downward trend sound like progress.
Right.
My question is for you is, and maybe this is part of our lessons learned, right? What practices have firms put in place to manage these issues? Because clearly they're probably not helping, would be my assumption based on those statistics that you just shared with us. But what have we been doing? What have firms been doing, and what's been the challenge here?
Well, as you said earlier, they have embraced, I think, to a significant point, the value proposition of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that, that being that diverse teams are much more innovative, much more effective at problem solving and creatively anticipating the marketplace than homogeneous teams are. Beyond that, they've invested in unconscious bias training. There has been strong recruiting efforts, mostly at the entry level and maybe into early management. There have even been a number of training programs, leadership development programs. There have been employee network groups to really help employees of diverse backgrounds find affinity, help support the organization's business outcomes through recruiting, through retention, through all kinds of initiatives, community-based as well. So there have been a lot of things done, but I think what's missing and what causes companies to lose the progress they've made is that the commitment from the top is not there. And so what you and I both know is that effective DEI engagement is leader-led. To be the most progressive, it has to be led from the top. So the message is only as important as the messenger. And that is why my article focused on CEOs have to step up. They can no longer defer to HR or suggest, okay, let's go do DE&I today. Yeah. This work has to be central to a company's culture, as well as as mission critical for driving significant and long-term business progress. That's how important it has to be.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because certainly you held this title of Chief Diversity Officer. Yeah. And rightfully or wrongfully, this is sort of what has traditionally happened, and certainly has happened now, that there's all of these chief diversity officer roles opened. I guess what would be interesting to understand from your perspective is, what are the opportunities and the limitations of that role, and what's the ideal working relationship between the CDO and the CEO? Because I feel like there's a tension and an opportunity there as we're having this conversation about whose responsibility is it.
Right. And so I've had the chance to work in companies where the CDO role reported into HR versus reporting into a business president or the CEO. And it's an interesting difference in terms of that reporting relationship. And I'm not so sure I lean on the side of having the CDO role always report in the CEO, because I think to some extent it depends on the maturity of the company's leadership around this topic, because I've reported into a CEO who couldn't care less that I was even there and really didn't exercise or engage with me very often because he was uncomfortable with this work. And it was just something that, that the leadership team chose to do because I think they were trying to force a lot of change in this family-owned company at the time. What ended up happening, though, is that the CEO went out to a business roundtable to talk about diversity, never consulted me to say, how are we doing? Give me some talking points, as you would expect, and got blown out of the room by some of the CEOs from major corporations, and this is food and manufacturing, who really were doing some things, to the best of their ability, and also were sharing their deep frustrations with, their sense of commitment, but not necessarily seeing the outcomes they desired. The next thing I know, I came back, I was at the office and I was told, the CEO wants to see you. And I thought, I wonder what this is about. Right. And when I got up there, he said to me, how long have you been with the company? And I said, 2 years. And he said, well, I imagine you're about trying to leave. I bet you're frustrated because I've not really connected with you. I've not spent much time with you. And he said, and I just came back from a meeting, and it's sad to say it took my own circle of CEOs to really open my eyes to the importance of this work. And he said, if you stick it out with me, I promise I will make it up to you. And we will drive this deep and aggressively, and we're going to start with some, give me 5 things you would want to see me do tomorrow. If I could,
what are some of those things that you told him you wanted him to do?
First of all, I wanted him to get a little bit of education. And I always start with that because sometimes, when rightfully or wrongfully, when CEOs are empowered by the board and have high expectations, they tend to imagine they should know everything. And quite honestly, nobody does. And I personally, submit to a learner mentality that I'm all about always learning, continuous learning. So I wanted to begin with some key books that I thought were important. I also, and one of the books I recommended at the time, this was years ago, was a book by Dr. Beverly Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Stories of Race. And I set him up with a mentor, and that mentor was Dr. Janetta Cole. I had him meet with employee groups and spend time out in the field. And then I wanted him to have a deep conversation with me about the strategy. Like, how do we get the leaders to own aspects of the strategy and drive greater accountability at the top of the house? Right. So those were some of the things that we immediately began to put into place. So I think that, and he said, I also invited Ted Childs. I don't know if you remember Ted, who was probably the guru of chief diversity officers at IBM under Gerstner at the time. And I invited him to come and speak to the executive leadership team. And Ted came in with all of his Tedness, which is profound and amazing and awe-inspiring. And after he left, my CEO said to me, you know why he's so effective? Because his CEO empowered him. That's what I need to do for you.
Right.
And boy, was that a turning point, and probably one of the best experiences and relationships I ever had with a CEO was in that, in that scenario and the aftermath of it. So a CEO empowerment, endorsement of this role and what it can become can be the difference between a highly effective sense of DEI, engagement, commitment, and progress versus one that can hardly get off the ground or is fleeting at best. So it's a lot about that senior executive and CEO accountability and empowerment.
So before I ask you some questions that bring us to the current context, I have one more question for you. And I think you started to hint at this a little bit when you were saying the progress that's been made around the business case for diversity. What would you say, if you had to summarize, are the key challenges or have been the key challenges in creating a conversation about racial equity and inclusion in corporations in the past?
Yeah, I think in the past has been the discomfort that comes from, white leaders in thinking that, that they are the cause, that they are the problem. And so, and I even wrote that, for a long time, it seemed that racial issues were black people's problems to go fix, go resolve. That's how it felt for me and many others. And so it was really difficult to talk about racial equity unless the world gave us a major reason to go do it.
Right.
Otherwise, in the tech world, there's a desire or a comfort with exceptionalizing the problem. Saying that there just aren't enough blacks in the pipeline getting computer science, degrees, engineering degrees, becoming developers. They're just not there. And eventually, to prove that wrong, they said the same thing about women too in computing. And we started to go gather numbers in partnership with the talent acquisition team. We engaged upon an effort to hire a recruiting firm to just go find all of the individuals, map them out across the U.S. who graduated with those degrees and who happen to be Hispanic or black. And we presented this sort of mapping and said, here they are, and they're there, they exist. Now we just have to convince them to come work for us. Because guess what? Just like women, they're not choosing us. That, even though the pipeline may not be as robust as we would want it to be ultimately in this field, it is certainly present and it exists, but they are opting out of coming into companies like ours.
Right.
They're choosing to, women were choosing to go to banking and healthcare companies and work as computer scientists, technologists in those firms because they were more female friendly.
Right.
And so certain groups of color, Latinos, Latinx, and blacks were not choosing to come to big mega companies, perhaps like Microsoft and others. So it was to help them see the error of that thinking, because that let them off of the moral hook or the emotional hook of thinking that we were not aggressively going after this population. We had gotten complacent thinking that they just don't exist. Yeah. And now we had to come up with a new way to explain this outcome. And it forced them to really think on it. The other thing is we went and did a study of the marketplace. Mm-hmm. Because, we talk about the value proposition of DEI and also talk about the fact that we want to be able to reflect, understand, and anticipate an increasingly diverse customer base. Mm-hmm. And so we went and did research on who over-indexed on Microsoft products. And it turned out the number one and number two groups who over-indexed on using our products were Latinos and Black people. Mm. And it was like a drop the mic moment, a drop your surface moment. And you could see how shocked leaders were. And we presented this at a broader leadership conference or discussion. And it was a real eye-opening moment. And those are the types of things that CDOs have to do to really convert leaders into rethinking. So sort of like learn. I want you to learn about some stuff. And then I want you to unlearn some things you were doing and relearn how to go after this group of very, very talented people. And by the way, when we talk about diversity, there's no substitute for equality. Right. One of the phrases I'd love to get out of people's mouths are saying qualified, diverse candidates. Well, you really think I want to go after unqualified talent? That's not who I am. But those terms are not mutually exclusive. Right. And those are some of the microaggressions that people of color, Black people experience all the time, that we're lowering the bar, lowering the standards to hire them. And it couldn't be furthest from the truth.
Right. So it's interesting as I listen to you talk about all this work that you did from a tech space to attract and recruit and bring people to tech. I can't help but reflect on how much we've talked about in the context of my own university is how we've seen the shift from students who've traditionally been going to banking and consulting moving towards tech. So I think just sort of anecdotally, qualitatively listening to what's been shared with us, I think there was some effectiveness to this strategy to draw people towards tech. That said, I wanted to reflect back on, I actually had pulled that same quote that you had started to share about Black people's issues. So I want to read that as I transition us into the present context. And so you write, after years of being told that racism was Black people's issues to solve, this new response of white solidarity is, at times, disorienting, but also cautiously uplifting. It is a time of deep reckoning and activism. I found that very powerful. So I want to, in your own words, and certainly I just gave them some of them back to you, is how would you describe this outpouring of corporate support for Black racial equality, for Black lives this summer, the summer of 2020?
Yeah, it's been very difficult to express the myriad of emotions I have had, and I know so many of my friends and colleagues have had as we watched what unfolded in this country. I still don't have words to explain it, but I don't think any of us saw it coming. While we hoped for more than just our own bodies to be present in this public demonstration and outcry for social justice, who would have expected that such a broad coalition of people, white suburban housewives, certainly millennials, Xers, boomers, corporate leaders, all stepping into the mix to declare how unjust this was and and calling for deep activism and deep change at the heart of this country. You know, it's sort of like it was a soul-searching moment and a highly reflective moment. So it's been crazy. I really haven't known what to make of it, and I think part of it is deeply personal for me because I'm so afraid to get let down. If I allow myself to get emotionally invested in the power of these voices, even though I do believe in them, I'm so not sure where this is going to go and if we're going to hit a free fall. Right. Because when you think about the cross-section of so many different coalitions of types of people coming together to demand equality, you have to wonder, how do we problem solve for such a diverse spectrum of expectations? Right. Because our millennials will want a certain outcome, and will that match what other groups expect and want? So I've been a little restrained on the emotional side because I've feared getting let down.
So let's talk a little bit about, and we started to get to this, but I just want to give you an opportunity to say more. When you look inside corporate entities, and we could think about the talent management system, we could think about just day-to-day management. What would you say have been some of the barriers that have prevented this type of support internally to firms?
Yeah, I think the barriers, particularly around black equity, is that people have sometimes lulled themselves into a false sense of believing, hey, we're all equal, all lives matter. And in the workplace, it's all about meritocracy. When in fact, that is probably the biggest misconception that I've seen in many of these corporate sectors, because there is so much opportunity and privilege, if you will, afforded certain communities at the expense of others. And I think not coming to grips with that and not understanding that and not willing to have an honest conversation about that. I think in the advent, too, of electing a black president, a lot of people wanted to believe, hey, we're a post-racial society now. We don't have any issues. Everybody's equal. Don't ask me for me to have to give up my piece of the pie so that someone like you can actually get ahead, because you guys have made progress. You're in. Everything's good. And I think that that's the biggest misconception about racial equity in the workplace, is that everybody is on a level playing field, and we know we're not. I wrote about Amy Cooper in my piece and what she represents. Amy Cooper, for those who, just as a refresher, was the white woman who was in Central Park with her dog, and she came into an area where there was a black man bird watching, and there was a legal leash requirement for dogs, and she didn't have her dog on the leash, and this man asked her to please put her dog off on a leash, and he videoed her ranting at him, and one of her rants was to say, I'm going to call the police and tell them that a black man is harassing me, is threatening my life. And the fact, what's huge about Amy Cooper and her presence and what she understood was that her behaviors toward this individual were conscious. There was nothing unconscious about her racial rant, right? There was nothing unconscious. But number two, she also understood the power that she had in this position as a white woman calling the police about a black man. She understood all too well that her white privilege afforded her the ability to do that, and imagine the police would just come to her rescue and arrest this guy, or worse off, even kill him right there for nothing. But she knew it. And she's a woman in her 40s. And I imagine, working in the financial industry, Amy Cooper had an opportunity to recruit, hire, promote, and manage black people. And I wonder how that went.
I mean, she's an executive, right?
She was an executive. She was a VP, absolutely. And it made me reflect on the reality that we have personalities like Amy's, and even worse, perhaps, in our workplaces, because our workplaces are a microcosm of broader society. What's happening in the world finds its way into the work environment. So we're not on a level playing field. This is not a post-racial society, not when you have a 40-year-old white woman doing what she did, and obviously educated, obviously very successful in her professional life. So to the extent to which Amy Cooper mindsets or mentalities exist in the workplace, how then could we say that we're post-racial, that everybody's on a level playing field? And I think it's because of that we see at times Black people getting some of the lowest promotions in the company. When you think about what we call readiness for advancement, promotion readiness, we sometimes say we'll assess people, ready in 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, or longer. And I know in one company, we actually did a study of that, and we began to look at the difference between how Black and brown people, Blacks and Hispanics, or Latinos, progressed along those career advancement recommendations versus white people. And we often found that if for a Black person it was noted that they were ready for promotion in 2 to 4 years, it actually took 3 to 5, or it actually took double for them. We could see evidence of that with no real explanation for why. So the reality is that, people have lulled themselves into a false sense of thinking that everything's good and everything's okay. But I have often been in rooms where the conversation allows us, if I'm in HR, to look at the data on performance ratings, if you will, and see where the racial demographic mixes come out. And in many sad scenarios, I have seen situations where Black and brown people are in the lower quadrant of those promotion opportunities or those ratings, and having to begin the series of questions like a 2-year-old. But why? But why is this so you say they plateaued, but why did they plateau? Who was managing them? Did they have a mentor? Did anybody reach out? And you start to do that, and you can see you're aggravating people because you're forcing them to have to go get a reason rather than an excuse to just say, well, they just didn't perform, or they're just not a fit. That's the other catch-all phrase for when certain people don't quite measure up, or we're not comfortable with how they show up in the workplace. The excuse, again, not a good fit.
So there's something that you said that I definitely want to amplify, and that is this idea that we don't leave ourselves at home. We actually bring those same selves to work. And so whether it's Amy Cooper or somebody else,
that's right.
If you see people acting and engaging in racist, sexist, homophobic ways outside of the workplace, it's very hard for us to imagine that they wouldn't be doing those same things inside of the workplace. And when that happens, that's why we have inequity and lack of opportunity. Is that fair summary of?
Absolutely, that's fair. That's very eloquently said too. And I think it just what I started to do in some companies, again, the education, the book reading, especially if I have senior executive leaders who were not born in the United States, I try to give them a sense of how can I offer you something that will help you get a grasp of the magnitude, the gravity of racial oppression in this country, and many of them have absolutely embraced the opportunity. And I think what they've come away with oftentimes, and I love when they want to have that deep conversation, is how did I not know? How did I not see the depth of these inequities in society? How did I overlook it? And the truth is, when something isn't your reality, you don't see it. When it's not, it's not your perspective, and it's like anything, imagine, for example, someone who has not had an experience with some type of disability suddenly finds themselves wheelchair bound. They start to experience the world very differently. But before, had a person said to them in a wheelchair, I really can't handle this because it's not done this way, it's not done that, it's not convenient for me, this environment is not inclusive for me. And, you might not be able to understand what they're talking about because it's not your reality. What's important when that happens is that you see this as a learning opportunity to broaden your insights and knowledge about things that you just don't know about. You're not aware, you're not, perhaps you're not paying attention to some extent, because I certainly think when it comes to race, I don't know how they don't know it, but okay, let's talk about all the things that have happened in the news. And I think for a lot of the scenarios where we see the police issues happening to people, and that's why I like the Amy Cooper example so much, because it's not about the police killing black people. Because I think we've almost become desensitized to it as a culture, because we see it so much and it's always been out there. And in order to protect themselves emotionally, a lot of people just sort of shut that thing down. But when you have a regular person behaving in this way to a black man for no real reason, it sort of shifts the conversation to, wow, white privilege is real. And this sense of thinking that her ability to call the police to get this man removed is okay, that what she did was okay. So I think the ability to help them see, no, this has always existed. You just didn't notice it. But now that you do, you can't unsee this. You cannot unsee it. And it should stay in your mind, and it should cause you to look at things with a new filter, right? It should change the way you view things going forward.
So you've already started to give us some brilliant suggestions for the future. Certainly, the title of your article where you're talking about the CEOs should lead is certainly a very concrete suggestion. You're talking about helping them to see. Before I ask you about some more concrete actions that you think we should do, and by we I mean senior leaders, middle managers, and individual contributors, basically people who have no particular authority but certainly might have passion or responsibility.
Yeah.
I want to just give one last piece from your article that I thought was a nice way of beginning to frame the possibilities for the future. And you said, with reference to the CEO, is the very first step these leaders should take in mitigating racial inequities in society is to look inward, starting with their own corporate cultures. And that struck me, I think, as being very powerful, because so much about these statements is reflecting on external society. And I think that is important because, again, I think it helps people to understand is the external world is showing up inside. But I think it's also very possible that we get stuck there, that it becomes a very philanthropic set of strategic initiatives as opposed to retooling and unearthing the issues that exist inside our corporate culture. So let's talk about cultural change. Let's talk about interpersonal behaviors. How do we begin to think about, from this perspective, again, of those three groups, senior leaders, middle managers, and then individual contributors, what should they be doing to help advance racial equity and inclusion?
Well, certainly senior leaders have a considerable amount of power and positioning on this topic that the other groups don't have. But I think at a base level, all groups need to invest in this effort. Whether you're an individual contributor or a middle manager or a senior leader, make the choice to consciously invest in issues of equity for all employees. I think, for some reason, and I don't know if this is if my theory holds water, but I kind of feel like if you make the work environment equitable for Black people, then probably all ships will rise with that one. Because certainly we've seen historically that with initiatives like affirmative action, white women have actually seen the greatest gains as a result of those. So I tend to think that when we focus on racial equity, all boats get lifted, all people's lives improve. But I think it's about having crucial conversations. I think the honest dialogues, creating a safe environment inside the workplace to have these honest dialogues is critical. Because especially when working in very, very large organizations where you have hundreds of thousands of people, there, and you're trying to get a grip around what can you do, how can you help the culture transform to be more inclusive. I do believe that seeing people as individuals and learning their stories, getting to know people, having that sense of connection across a shared humanity makes a huge difference. And one of the things before I left Microsoft that we were really invested on trying to do that. And we created with an external consultant a learning and development initiative, not a training, a learning and development initiative called Dialogues Across Differences. And we used theatrical, people, actors, who were very well honed in HR, policy, mediation, and they would create scenes from the workplace that were very credible and real to our culture, and freeze the activity on stage at the height of a conflict, and then engage with the audience in what they saw. And now, throughout my 25 plus years, I've worked with a number of theatrical groups. They're not all equal. This one was extraordinarily good. It is a facilitated scenario as well, and the facilitator plays an important role with setting the tone in the room and helping to manage the dialogue, because you can have saboteurs in the audience, like anything else, who really don't want to buy into stuff. But the level of in-depth tension at times, but deep exposure and learning that took place in those sessions, I think garnered us some of the best applause from inside Microsoft. People said this was the first time that they had had a chance to hear a person share their truth in a way that was meaningful to them, because they knew this person. They had no idea that they had these lived experiences. So I think when people come together in safe places to have these conversations and their lived experiences are shared in ways that are deep and meaningful and help create empathy in the workplace, then you get somewhere. You kind of break down the silos or the notion that you already understand what's happening in the world and you don't want to invest. So I think that those sessions were extremely helpful. We learned to do them virtually, and we did them on every continent, which is not easy. So I think things like that really, really help. I also believe that at the executive level, having intentional talent talks around Black professionals, women, Latinos, Asians, all the different groups is important, because what I find in organizations where particularly Black and Latinos are not well represented, no one sees them. They can become very invisible. They can become the only one in the team. And it is an issue with retention because of that, especially in the tech world, developers coming into large teams and you're the only woman of color, woman, or Black or brown woman there. You feel so isolated, so alone, and it can be really hard early in your career to build the resilience for that. So I think intentional talent talks, get to know who these individuals are and stop just looking at the data, looking at spreadsheets and numbers. Because at the end of the day, and I used to say this all the time, hey, there are real people connected to these decimal points and percentages, and they have very differing experiences in our workplace. And it's so important that we drill down on what that is and not just focus on the numbers. We have to focus on people at individual levels.
I think this has been such a wonderful opportunity to learn the core set of issues, but also to feel that there are things that can be done. And I love these two examples. Certainly, we've heard a lot about having conversations and why that's important, and we've certainly seen an equal amount of criticism. Well, let's stop talking and start acting. But talking actually is action, especially when we need to learn, right? We need to understand,
right,
or we actually do. And so I think that sometimes gets shortchanged. And certainly, as a faculty member at an institution, we love talking about evidence-based practice. And so we love our numbers. But what you're saying is there's a story behind the numbers, and let's make sure we've
Absolutely.
got that right so that we can create policies, practices, initiatives that are targeted for the specific needs of individuals and not just based on our gross estimations. Gwen, thank you so much for joining us.
I just had one quick thing. Sorry, to talk about how do we move from conversation to action. The intentional talent talks are all about getting us to action, because when you drill down and understand who these individuals are, what they've accomplished in their time at your company or even prior to, and where they hope to go, what are their ambitions career-wise, then you can be much more strategic in making sure that something great happens for them, that now you know who they are, let's go move them forward. And we have, in some companies taken aggressive action steps and created the plans as here are the ready for promotion now people. They have hit all of the buttons that we've said we needed. Go promote them within the next month. Here's what you will do. We actually created the action step for the leader and said, here's what you will go do now. So that can actually be one of the most aggressive and probably most successful approaches because it is evidence-based, and now it helps the leader know how to go move forward with the right steps. And it was one of the most, I think, successful initiatives that I had seen in my career.
Fantastic. Gwen, thank you so much. Your time, your expertise is absolutely an invaluable resource for us all. I look forward to continuing to engage with you around this topic and seeing all the great work you're doing. So thank you again. And again, the article that Gwen wrote is called Corporate America's Black Equity Gap. CEOs Must Take the Lead. It was published on Medium on June 29th, 2020. Have a great afternoon, Gwen, and I'll talk to you soon.
You too. Thanks so much, Stephanie. Enjoyed it.